What is your outlook on the future of the U.S. and foreign policy and these regime changes and these wars in the Middle East, especially with if Biden is the president now and who he's going to surround himself with? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? How you feel about it?
I'm not looking forward to a sharp change in the way America approaches the rest of the world. Since the end of the Second World War, the United States has had the view that we need to be the dominant power everywhere on Earth. At the end of the Cold War, around 1990, we had a chance to recalibrate our approach to the world and accept the fact that the world could be multipolar, and we won our ideological battle, and we shouldn't insist on continuing the struggle for full spectrum dominance, as they call it in Washington. But we pushed ahead on that project. We decided we still wanted to control the world. NATO, which was the alliance created to control the Soviet Union, didn't dissolve when the Soviet Union fell apart. In fact, it got stronger, built a new building, and took on all kinds of new missions. So I don't think that Biden is going to take the United States out of the mindset that we have to be the dominant power in the world and that we know what's good for the world better than the world itself knows. That principle has always guided American foreign policy. Now, that said, I can see that there could be some nibbling around the edges. I can't imagine, for example, that there will be a slight decrease in tensions between the US and Iran. They have reached such crazy levels in the last few years that they might be able to be dialed down, hopefully back to the level at least that they were 4 years ago, which wasn't very friendly, but at least we didn't feel we were on the brink of war. I'd like to see, and I think I would expect to see some changes in U.S. relations with Cuba. There have been some very intense new sanctions just imposed that prevent Cuban Americans from even sending remittances back to Cuba. I could see Biden lifting those. I could see him taking the United States back into the World Health Organization, back into the Paris Climate Accord. But that he would fundamentally re-examine the question of whether the United States needs to be controlling places all over the world, I see that as far-fetched. He's very much a product of the American foreign policy establishment. Remember that Biden has spent his entire adult life as a senator in Washington. He was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He voted for the Iraq War and was a leading promoter of it, because as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Biden had the chance to call witnesses who would have testified that going into Iraq was a bad idea. That would have given Americans the other side of the argument. But Biden never called those people. As a result, an entire side of the argument that it was not a good idea to invade Iraq, never got a platform. And I attribute that largely to Biden as chairman. It was up to him to set up the witness lists. So I do think it's a product of the traditional foreign policy orthodoxy in the United States, but I would add this caveat. The American people and the voting blocs in both parties are increasingly in favor of a more restrained foreign policy. A number of public opinion surveys show this. The only place in the United States where there's still real appetite for foreign wars and foreign intervention is Washington, D.C. The public has left this behind. They don't want to do it anymore. But Washington is so fueled by foreign money and foreign pressures and all sorts of imperial fantasies that it can't break this addiction. Now, Biden, to my mind, is not a person of deep ideological or passionate conviction. And the same goes for Kamala Harris. They're pragmatists. They don't have deep beliefs. So I think they're willing to be shaped by circumstance. One of those circumstances is that the public, and including the base of the Democratic Party, doesn't want to continue these constant foreign conflicts. And I think if there's enough pressure from below, if the forces favoring restraint and limited foreign policy can organize and show Biden that this is where the party is now, that might have an effect. And although I'm not optimistic about the kinds of people that he's going to appoint to national security jobs, I do think that he will evolve as feels public opinion evolves. And that gives those of us who have a voice the responsibility to show him that public opinion is not where it was when we launched the Iraq War almost 20 years ago.
Now, I heard you mention briefly on another podcast that you did that obviously there was a lot of presidential candidates who were very outspoken on foreign policy, like Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders. Is it true that when a president wants to implement domestic policies versus foreign policies, there's a lot more hoops they have to jump through with, like, Congress won't let them enforce their tax laws, the changes in like taxes or universal health care or education. But when it comes to foreign policy, it's much easier for them to get things done.
Well, let me answer that by telling you a story. I once had the opportunity to spend an hour sitting around chatting with Jimmy Carter. It happened that he actually came to Nicaragua while I was the New York Times bureau chief there, and he wanted to see me, and we had a very nice chat. And here's one of the things he told me. He said, when I became president, I decided I wanted to consult with all the living former presidents in private and just have a chat with them about what do you do? How do you do this job? How do you be president? What advice do you have for me? So I brought them in very quietly, and we had private conversations. He said, so I brought in Nixon. And I said to him, what's your advice on how to be president? And Nixon told me, you know something, domestic policy is too frustrating. When you come into office, there's going to be a problem with education. There's going to be a problem with housing. There's going to be a problem with healthcare. There's going to be a problem with public welfare. When you leave for office, those problems are still going to be there. Yeah, you can do something. You can nibble around the edges. But it's so frustrating. You've got Congress, you've got so many vested interests, and issues are so complex. You appoint yourself a good environmental protection administrator and a good housing secretary and tell them to do the best they can. But world affairs is so much more fun because there you can really get things done. All you have to do is sign a piece of paper and your policy towards the whole part of the world changes. So I always kept that story in mind, and I think it's very true. These things that progressives talk about, like Medicare for all, or let's say free tuition in public universities, I think those seem like no-brainers, but those are really difficult projects to get done. We saw what we went through with Obamacare. It was tormentuous, and then it came out as a grotesque caricature of a healthcare bill because so many different interests had to be accommodated. In foreign policy, it isn't like that. Look what President Trump did with Iran. With one stroke of a pen, he pulled the United States out of a profoundly important deal that was going to not only prevent Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon, but lay the basis for some long-term stability in the Middle East. With one signature, he got rid of that. He abolished that. So it tells me that Biden also can do much, much more, incomparably more in foreign policy than he can in domestic policy, certainly in the short term. And the short term is very important now because we don't know what's going to happen in 4 years. You know, one thing we saw with Trump is that you can rip a whole structure apart very quickly. So this puts, I think, a different lens on foreign policy. It has to be looking for somewhat shorter term returns now. You can't just set in motion a policy hoping for a return in 20 years, which is what good foreign policy should do, because you don't know what's going to happen with the next spasm in American domestic politics. Therefore, I don't expect dramatic changes from a Biden administration. I'm looking at the people he's bringing into government as more or less the Obama crowd. And you'll remember that Obama dropped more bombs than George W. Bush and was involved in wars in 7 countries and set Libya on fire and helped devastate Syria. So I don't see a change in basic mindset. I can see some of the excesses to which Trump pushed us being moderated, but a true re-examination of whether it makes sense for the United States to spend its resources policing Ukraine and the South China Sea and everywhere else in the world, I don't see that.